Good evening. Welcome back to the shed. Thank you for joining me once again on this reading of C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Tonight we will be reading chapters 15 and 16. So please, if you would, join along with me in the book. Chapter 15. While the two girls still crouched in the bushes, with their hands over their faces, they heard the voice of the witch calling out, "Now, follow me all, and we will set about what remains of this war. It will not take us long to crush the human vermin and traitors now that the great fool, the great cat, lies dead." At this moment, the children were for a few seconds in very great danger, for with wild cries and a noise of shrieking pipes and shrill horns blowing, the whole of that vile rabble came sweeping off the hilltop and down the slope right past their hiding place. They felt the specters go by them like a cold wind, and they felt the ground shake beneath them under the galloping feet of the minotaurs, and overhead there went a flurry of foul wings and a blackness of vultures and giant bats. At any other time they would have trembled with fear, but now the sadness and shame and horror of Aslan's death so filled their minds that they hardly thought of it. As soon as the wood was silent again, Susan and Lucy crept out into the open hilltop. The moon was getting low, and thin clouds were passing across her, but still they could see the shape of the great lion lying dead in his bonds. And down they both knelt in the wet grass, and kissed his cold face, and stroked his beautiful fur, what was left of it, and cried till they could cry no more. And then they looked at each other and held each other's hands for mere loneliness, and cried again. And then again were silent. At last Lucy said, "I can't bear the look of that horrible muzzle. I wonder if we could take it off." So they tried, and after a lot of working at it, for their fingers were cold, and it was now the darkest part of the night, they succeeded. And when they saw his face without it, they burst out crying again, and kissed it, and fondled it, and wiped away the blood and the foam as well as they could. And it was all more lonely and hopeless and horrid than I know how to describe. "I wonder, could we untie him as well?" said Susan persistently. But the enemies, out of pure spitefulness, had drawn the cords so tight that the girls could make nothing of the knots. I hope no one who reads this book has been quite as miserable as Susan and Lucy were that night. But if you have been up all night and cried till you have no more tears left in you, you will know that there comes in the end a sort of quietness. You feel as if nothing was ever going to happen again. At any rate, that was how it felt to these two. Hours and hours seemed to go by in this dead calm, and they hardly noticed that they were getting colder and colder. But at last Lucy noticed two other things. One was that the sky on the east side of the hill was a little less dark than it had been an hour ago. The other was that some tiny movement was going on in the grass at her feet. At first she took no interest in this. What did it matter? Now, nothing mattered now. But at last she saw whatever it was had begun to move up the upright stones of the stone table. And now whatever they were moving about on Aslan's body. She peered closer. There were little gray things. "Ugh!" said Susan from the other side of the table. "How beastly! There are horrid little mice crawling all over him. Go away, you little beasts!" And she raised her hand to frighten them away. "Wait," Lucy said, who had been looking at them more closely still. "Can you see what they're doing?" Both the girls bent down and stared. "I do believe," said Susan. "But how queer! They're nibbling away at the cords." "That's what I thought," said Lucy. "I think they're friendly mice. Poor little things, they don't realize he's dead. They think it'll do some good untying him." It was quite definitely lighter by now. Each of the girls noticed for the first time the white face of the other. Then they could see the mice nibbling away, dozens and dozens, even hundreds of little field mice. And at last, one by one, the ropes were all gnawed through. The sky in the east was whitish by now, and the stars were getting fainter, all except one, very big one low down on the eastern horizon. They felt colder than they had been all night. The mice crept away again. The girls cleared away the remains of the gnawed ropes. Aslan looked more like himself without them. Every moment his dead face looked nobler as the light grew, and they could see it better. In the wood behind them, a bird gave a chuckling sound. It had been so still for hours and hours that it startled them. Then another bird answered it. Soon there were birds singing all over the place. It was quite definitely early morning now, not late night. "I'm so cold," said Lucy. "So am I," said Susan. "Let's walk about a bit." They walked to the eastern edge of the hill and looked down. The one big star had almost disappeared. The country all looked dark gray, but beyond, at the very end of the world, the sea showed pale. The sky began to turn red. They walked to and fro more times than they could count between the dead Aslan and the eastern ridge, trying to keep warm. And oh, how they tired their legs felt. Then, at least, as they stood for a moment, looking out towards the sea and Cair Paravel, which they could now just make out, the red turned to gold along the line where the sea and the sky met, and very slowly up came the edge of the sun. At that moment they heard from behind them a loud noise, a great cracking, deafening noise, as if a giant had broken a giant's plate. "What's that?" said Lucy, clutching Susan's arm. I feel afraid to turn around," said Susan. "Something awful is happening." "They're doing something worse to him," said Lucy. "Come on," and she turned, pulling Susan round with her. The rising of the sun had made everything look so different. All the colors and shadows were changed, that for a moment they didn't see the important thing. Then they did. The stone table was broken into two pieces by a great crack that ran down it from end to end, and there was no Aslan. "Oh! Oh! Oh!" cried the two girls, rushing back to the table. "Oh, it's too bad," sobbed Lucy. "They might have left the body alone." "Who's done it?" cried Susan. "What does it mean? Is it more magic?" "Yes," said a great voice behind their backs. "It is more magic." They looked around. There, shining in the sunrise, larger than they had seen him before, shaking his mane, for it had apparently grown again, stood Aslan himself. "Oh, Aslan!" cried both the children, staring up at him, almost as much frightened as they were glad. "Aren't you dead, then, dear Aslan?" said Lucy. "Not now," said Aslan. "You're not asked Susan in a shaky voice. She couldn't bring herself to say the word ghost. Aslan stooped his golden head and licked her forehead. The warmth of his breath and a rich sort of smell that seemed to hang about his hair came all over her. "Do I look it?" he said. "Oh, you're real! You're real! Oh, Aslan!" cried Lucy, and both the girls flung themselves upon him and covered him with kisses. "But what does it all mean?" asked Susan, when they were somewhat calmer. "It means," said Aslan, "that though the witch knew the deep magic, there is a magic deeper still, which she did not know. Her knowledge goes back only to the dawn of time. But if she could have looked a little further back into the stillness and darkness before time dawned, she would have read there a different incantation. She would have known that when a willing victim who had committed no treachery was killed in a traitor's stead, the table would crack and death itself would start working backwards. And now—" "Oh yes, now," said Lucy, jumping up and clapping her hands. "Oh, children," said the lion, "I feel my strength coming back to me. O children, catch me if you can. He stood for a second, his eyes very bright, his limbs quivering, lashing himself with his tail. Then he made a leap high over their heads and landed on the other side of the table. Laughing, though she did not know why, Lucy scrambled over to it to reach him. Aslan leapt again. A mad chase began. Round and round the hilltop he led them, now hopelessly out of their reach, now letting them almost catch his tail, now diving between them, now tossing them in the air with his huge and beautifully velveted paws and catching them again, and now stopping unexpectedly so that all three of them rolled over together in a happy, laughing heap of fur and arms and legs. It was such a romp as no one has ever had except in Narnia. And whether it was more like playing with a thunderstorm or playing with a kitten, Lucy could never make up her mind. And the funny thing was that when all three finally lay together, panting in the sun, the girls no longer felt in the least tired or hungry or thirsty. And now, said Aslan persistently, to busyness. I feel I am going to roar. You had better put your fingers in your ears. And they did. And Aslan stood up, and when he opened his mouth to roar, his face became so terrible that they did not dare to look at it. And then they saw all the trees in front of him bend before the blast of his roaring, as grass bends in a meadow before the wind. Then he said, "We have a long journey to go. You must ride on me." And he crouched down, and the children climbed onto his warm golden back, and Susan sat first, holding on tightly to his mane, and Lucy sat behind, holding on tightly to Susan. And with a great heave, he rose underneath them, and then shot off, faster than any horse could go, downhill and into the thick of the forest. That ride, perhaps, was the most wonderful thing that happened to them in Narnia. Have you ever had a gallop on a horse? Think of that, and then take away the heavy noise of the hooves and the jingle of the harness, and imagine instead that the almost noiseless padding of great paws. Then imagine instead of the black or gray or chestnut back of the horse, the soft roughness of golden fur and the mane of flying back in the wind. And then imagine you are going about twice as fast as the fastest racehorse. But this is a mount that doesn't need to be guided and never grows tired. He rushes on and on, never missing his footing, never hesitating, threading his way with perfect skill between tree trunks, jumping over bush and briar and the smaller streams, wading the larger, swimming the largest of all. And you are riding not on a road, nor in a park, nor even on the downs, but right across Narnia, in spring, down solemn avenues of beech and across sunny glades of oak, through wild orchards of snow-white cherry trees, past roaring waterfalls and mossy rocks, and echoing caverns, up windy slopes all right with gorse bushes and across the shoulders of heathery mountains, and along giddy ridges, and down, down, down again into wild valleys, and out into acres of blue flowers. It was nearly midday when they found themselves looking down a steep hillside at a castle. A little toy castle it looked from where they stood, but which seemed to be all pointed towers. But the lion was rushing down at such a speed that it grew larger every moment, and before they had time to even ask themselves what it was, they were already on level with it. And now it no longer looked like a toy castle, but rose frowning in front of them. No face looked over the battlements, and the gates were fast shut. And Aslan, not at all slacking in his pace, rushed straight as a bullet towards it. "The witch is home," he cried. "Now, children, hold tight." Next moment the whole world seemed to turn upside down, and the children felt as if they had left their insides behind them, for the lion had gathered himself together for a greater leap than any he had yet made, and jumped. You may call it flying rather than jumping, right over the castle wall. The two girls, breathless but unhurt, found themselves trembling off his back in the middle of a wide stone courtyard full of statues. Chapter 16. "What an extraordinary place!" cried Lucy. "All those stone animals, and people too. It's like a museum." "Hush," said Susan. "Aslan's doing something." He was indeed. He had bound up the stone lion and breathed on him. Then, without waiting a moment, he whisked round, almost as if he had been a cat chasing its tail, and breathed also on the stone dwarf, which, as you remember, was standing a few feet from the lion with his back to it. Then he pounced on a tall stone dryad, which stood beyond the dwarf, turned rapidly aside to deal with a stone rabbit on his right, and rushed on to two centaurs. But at that moment Lucy said, "Oh, Susan, look at the lion." I expect you've seen someone put a lighted match to a bit of newspaper, which is propped up in a grate against an unlit fire, and for a second nothing seems to have happened, and then you notice a tiny streak of flame creeping along the edge of the newspaper. It was like that now. For a second after Aslan had breathed upon him, the stone lion looked just the same. Then a tiny streak of gold began to run along his white marble back. Then it spread. Then the color seemed to lick all over him, as a flame licks all over the bit of paper. Then, while his hindquarters were still obviously stone, the lion shook his mane, and all the heavy, stony folds rippled into liveling hair. Then he opened a great red mouth, warm and living, and gave a prodigious yawn, and his hind legs had come to life. He lifted one of them and scratched it himself. Then, having caught sight of Aslan, he went bounding after him, and frisking around him, whimpering with delight, and jumping to lick his face. Of course the children's eyes turned to follow the lion, but the sight they saw was so wonderful that they had soon forgot about him. Everywhere the statues were coming to life. The courtyard looked no longer like a museum, it looked more like a zoo. Creatures were running after Aslan and dancing around him till he was almost hidden in the crowd. Instead of all that deadly white, the courtyard was now a blaze of colors. Glossy chestnut sides of centaurs, indigo horns of unicorns, dazzling plumage of birds, reddy brown of foxes, dogs, and satyrs, yellow stockings and crimson hoods of dwarfs, and the birch girls in silver, and the beech girls in fresh, transparent green, and the larch girls in green so bright that it was almost yellow. And instead of the deadly silence, the whole place rang with the sound of happy roarings, brayings, yelpings, barkings, squealings, cooings, neighings, stampings, shouts, hurrahs, songs, and laughter. "Oh," said Susan in a different tone, "look, is it safe?" Lucy looked and saw that Aslan just breathed on the feet of the stone giant. "It's all right," shouted Aslan joyously. "Once the feet are put right, all the rest of him will follow." "That was exactly what I meant," whispered Susan to That wasn't exactly what I meant, whispered Susan to Lucy. But it was too late to do anything about it, even if Aslan would have listened to her. The change was already creeping up the giant's legs. Now he was moving his feet. A moment later he lifted the club off his shoulder, rubbed his eyes, and said, "Bless me, I must have been asleep. Now, where's that dratted little witch that was running around on the ground? Somewhere just by my feet it was." But when everyone had shouted up to him to explain what had really happened, and what the giant had put his hands to his ear and got them to repeat it all again, so that at last he understood, then he bowed down till his head was no further off the top of a haystack, and touched his cap repeatedly to Aslan. Beaming all over his honest, ugly face, giants of any sort are now so rare in England, and so few giants are good-tempered, that 10 to 1 you have never seen a giant when his face is beaming. It's a sight well worth looking at. "Now for the inside of this house," said Aslan. "Look alive, everyone! Upstairs and downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. Leave no corner unsearched. You never know where some poor prisoner may be concealed." And into the interior they all rushed, and for several minutes the whole of that dark, horrible, fussy old castle echoed with the opening of windows, and with everyone's voices crying out at once, "Don't forget the dungeons! Give us a hand with this door! Here's another little winding stair! Oh, I say, here's a poor little kangaroo! Call Aslan! Phew! How it smells in here! Look out for trapdoors! Up here, there are a whole lot more on the landing!" But the best of all was when Lucy came rushing upstairs, shouting out, "Aslan! Aslan! I found Mr. Tumnus! Oh, do come quick!" A moment later, Lucy and the little fawn were holding one another by both hands and dancing around and round for joy. The little chap was none the worse off for having been a statue, and was of course very interested in all she had to tell him. But at last the ransacking of the witch's fortress was ended. The whole castle stood empty, with every door and window open, and the light and the sweet spring air flooding into all the dark and evil places which needed them so badly. The whole crowd of liberated statues surged back into the courtyard, and it was then that someone, Tumnus I think, first said, "But how are we going to get out?" For Aslan had got in by a jump, and the gates were still locked. "That'll be all right," said Aslan, and then, rising up on his hind legs, he bawled up at the giant. "Hi, you up there," he roared. "What's your name?" "Giant Rumblebuffin, if it please your honor," said the giant, once more touching his cap. "Well then, Giant Rumblebuffin," said Aslan, "just let us out of this, will you?" "Certainly, your honor. It will be a pleasure," said Giant Rumblemuffin. "Stand well away from the gates, all you little uns." Then he stood at the gate himself, and bang, bang, bang went his huge club. The gates creaked at the first blow, cracked at the second, and shriveled at the third. Then he tackled the towers on each side of them, and after a few minutes of crashing and thudding, both the towers and a good bit of the wall on each side went thundering down in a mass of hopeless rubble. And when the dust cleared, it was odd, standing in that dry, grim, stony yard, to see through the gap all the grass and waving trees and sparkling streams of the forest, and the blue hills beyond that, and beyond them the sky. "Blowed if I ain't all in a muck sweat," said the giant, puffing like the largest railway engine. "Comes of being out of condition, I suppose. Neither of you young ladies has such a thing as a pocket handkerchief about you." "Yes, I have," said Lucy, standing on tiptoes and holding her handkerchief up as far as she could reach. "Thank you, missy," said Giant Rumblebuffin, stooping down. Next moment Lucy got rather a fright, for she found herself caught up in mid-air between the giant's finger and a thumb. But just as she was getting near his face, he suddenly started and then put her gently back on the ground, muttering, "Bless me, I've picked up a little girl instead. I beg your pardon, missy. I thought you was the handkerchief." "No, no," said Lucy, laughing. "Here it is." This time he managed to get it, but it was only about the same size to him as a saccharin tablet would be to you, or a saccharin tablet would be to you. So that when she saw him solemnly rubbing it to and fro across his great red face, she said, "I'm afraid it's not much use to you, Mr. Rumblebuffin." "No, not at all, not at all," said the giant politely. "Never met a nicer handkerchief, so fine, so handy, so I don't know how to describe it." "What a nice giant he is," said Lucy to Mr. Tumnus. "Oh, yes," replied the fawn. "All the Buffins always were. One of the most respected of all the giant families in Narnia. Not very clever, perhaps. I never knew a giant that was. But an old family, with traditions, you know. If he'd been the other sort, she'd never have turned him into stone. At this point, Aslan clapped his paws together and called for silence. Our day's work is not yet over, he said, and if the witch is to be finally defeated before bedtime, we must find the battle at once. And join in, I hope, sir, added the largest of the centaurs. Of course, said Aslan. And now, those who can't keep up, that is, children, dwarfs, and small animals, must ride on the backs of those who can. That is, lions, centaurs, unicorns, horses, giants, and eagles. Those who are good with their noses must come in the front with us lions to smell out where the battle is. Look lively and sort yourselves. And with a great deal of bustle and cheering, they did. The most pleased of the lot was the other lion, who kept running about everywhere pretending to be very busy, but really in order to say to everyone he met, Did you hear what he said? Us lions. That means him and me. Us lions. That's what I like about Aslan. No side, no standoffishness. Us lions. That meant him and me. At last he went on saying this till Aslan had loaded him up with 3 dwarves, 1 dryad, 2 rabbits, and a hedgehog. That steadied him a bit. When all were ready, it was a big sheepdog who actually helped Aslan the most in getting them sorted into their proper order. They set out through the gap in the castle wall. At first the lions and dogs went nosing about in all directions. But then suddenly, one great hound picked up the scent and gave a bay. There was no time lost after that. Soon all the dogs and lions and wolves and other hunting animals were going at full speed, with their noses to the ground, and all the others streaked out for about half a mile behind them, were following as fast as they could. The noise was like an English fox hunt, only better because now and then, with the music of the hounds, was mixed the roar of the other lion, and sometimes the far deeper and more awful roar of Aslan himself. Faster and faster they went, as the scent became easier and easier to follow. And then, just as they came to the last curve in a narrow, winding valley, Lucy heard above all the noises another noise, a different one, which gave her a queer feeling inside. It was a noise of shouts and shrieks and of clashing metal against metal. Then they came out of the narrow valley, and at once she saw the reason. There stood Peter and Edmund and all the rest of Aslan's army, fighting desperately against the crowd of horrible creatures whom she had sent last night. Only now in the daylight they looked even stranger and more evil and more deformed. There also seemed to be far more of them. Aslan's army, which had their backs to her, looked terribly few, and there were statues dotted all over the battlefield, so apparently the witch had been using her wand, but she did not seem to be using it now. She was fighting with her stone knife. It was Peter she was fighting, both of them going at it so hard that Lucy could hardly make out what was happening. She only saw the stone knife and Peter's sword flashing so quickly that they looked like 3 knives and 3 swords. That pair were in the center. On each side, the line stretched out. Horrible things were happening wherever she looked. "Off my back, children," shouted Aslan, and they both tumbled off. Then with a roar that shook all Narnia from the western lamppost to the shores of the eastern sea, the great beast flung himself upon the White Witch. Lucy saw her face lifted towards him for 1 second with an expression of terror and amazement. The lion and the witch had rolled over together, but with the witch underneath, and at the same moment all warlike creatures whom Aslan had led from the witch's house rushed madly on the enemy's line. Dwarfs with their battle axes, dogs with teeth, the giant with his club, and his feet also crushed dozens of the foe. Unicorns with their horns, centaurs with swords and hooves, and Peter's tired army cheered, and the newcomers roared, and the enemy squealed and gibbered till the wood re-echoed with the din of that onset. Thus ends chapter 16 and tonight's reading of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Thank you for joining me, and be kind and good to each other until I see you again.